The call came in at 4:11 in the morning. A female voice, barely audible, told the dispatcher that our roommates were unresponsive. Then she said something that would haunt investigators for months. She didn't know if they were breathing. The dispatcher asked her to check. The line stayed open. Silence, then a faint sound. Movement, maybe footsteps, and then nothing useful. No screaming. No description of an intruder. No sound of a door. Just the particular stillness of a house that had already been changed by something irreversible. By the time Moscow police arrived at 1122 King Road, it was 4:17 a.m. on November the 13th, 2022. The house was a 2-story rental, white with dark trim, sitting at the edge of the University of Idaho campus, in a neighborhood where student rentals and faculty homes sat side by side on quiet, tree-lined streets. The porch light was on. A few windows glowed faintly from the inside. Officers approached the front door. It was unlocked. They stepped inside. What they found on the upper floors of that house would trigger the largest criminal investigation in Idaho state history. A case that would consume thousands of hours of law enforcement resources, generate more than 9,000 tips, fracture a college town's sense of safety, and place a 28-year-old PhD student at the center of a story that nobody in Moscow, Idaho, had any framework to understand. To understand how we arrived at that Sunday morning in November, you have to go back, not years, but months, because this case didn't begin with a stranger arriving from nowhere. It began with a neighborhood, a house, and 4 people who had every reason to believe they were safe. Moscow, Idaho, sits in the northern panhandle of the state, roughly 8 miles from the Washington border. Population around 26,000, about half of whom are connected in some way to the University of Idaho. It's the kind of town where the football schedule is a civic event, where the coffee shops know your order by Tuesday of your first week, where the crime blotter in the local paper runs mostly to noise complaints and parking violations. The streets around campus are wide and unhurried. The houses are mostly older wood frame or brick rentals, the kind with deep porches and unlocked back doors and neighbors who recognize your car. Violent crime is not absent, but it is rare enough that when it happens, the whole town feels it personally. The University of Idaho enrolled roughly 12,000 students in the fall of 2022. Among them were 4 friends who shared the house on King Road. Ethan Chapin, 20 years old, from Conway, Washington, a member of the Sigma Chi fraternity, known by his teammates and fraternity brothers as someone who filled a room with easy energy. Xana Kernodle, 20 years old, from Post Falls, Idaho, his girlfriend, a junior majoring in marketing, who had a close circle and a reputation for being the person her friends called when something went wrong. Madison Mogen, 21 years old, from Sandpoint, Idaho, a senior also majoring in marketing, who had grown up in the mountain resort town 2 hours to the east and carried that particular confidence of someone who had always known exactly where home was. And Kaylee Goncalves, 21 years old, also from Sandpoint, Madison's closest friend since childhood, the kind of friendship that predates high school, that survives the distance of college, that shows up in every photograph as 2 people who have long since stopped needing to explain themselves to each other. 2 of them had grown up together. All 4 of them had ended up, by the particular logic of college life, in the same house on the same street at the same time. The house itself had 6 bedrooms spread across 2 floors. 2 other roommates, Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen, also lived there, occupying rooms on the main floor. They were home that night. They survived. The geography of the house, who slept where, which floor, which end of the hallway, would become significant in ways that nobody who signed that lease in August could have anticipated. On the night of November 12th, a Saturday, all 4 victims had been out separately before converging back at King Road. Ethan and Xana had attended a Sigma Chi party on campus, the kind of late fall gathering that marks the last warm weekends before the Palouse winter sets in hard. Kaylee and Maddie had spent the evening at a bar called the Corner Club on Main Street in downtown Moscow, a narrow, brick-walled place with a long wooden bar and the particular loud warmth of a Saturday night crowd. They stayed until the bar closed, then stopped at a food truck called Grub Truck, parked on the edge of downtown just after 1:30 in the morning. Security camera footage captured them there, laughing, talking, leaning against the counter while they waited for their order. They looked like 2 people at the end of a good night. They shared a ride home with a driver they'd called through a rideshare app. The car dropped them off at 1122 King Road at approximately 1:56 a.m. Ethan and Xana had arrived back at the house a few minutes earlier, around 1:45 a.m. By 2 a.m., all 4 of them were inside. The house settled. The lights on the upper floor went on, then off. The street outside was quiet. A few cars passed on the road that runs along the edge of campus. The temperature that night was in the low 30s, cold enough that breath showed in the air, cold enough that anyone moving through the neighborhood would have been moving quickly, collar up, hands in pockets. The medical examiner would later determine that all 4 were killed between 3 and 4 a.m. The weapon was a fixed-blade knife. The manner of death was multiple sharp force injuries. The killer entered the house, moved through it, and left. No one heard anything loud enough to respond to. No one called 911 during the attack itself. The house sat quiet on King Road for the next several hours while the rest of Moscow slept, while the temperature outside dropped another 2 degrees, while the sky over the Palouse began its slow shift from black to the flat gray of a November dawn. It was Dylan Mortensen who made the 411 call. She had woken up sometime in the early morning hours, seen and heard things she couldn't fully process in the moment, things that her mind, in the fog of being suddenly awake at 4 a.m., may have tried to fit into some less catastrophic explanation before the weight of them became undeniable. She eventually reached for her phone. The exact sequence of what she saw, when she saw it, and what she did in the time between waking and calling 911 became one of the most scrutinized threads of the entire investigation. Not because she was a suspect, she wasn't, and investigators cleared her relatively early, but because her account was the only first-hand witness narrative that existed from inside that house on that night, and every detail of it mattered enormously. Moscow Police Chief James Fry held a press conference on November 13th, the same afternoon the bodies were discovered. He stood at a podium in front of the department's low brick building on East 3rd Street and confirmed 4 fatalities. He confirmed the deaths were homicides. He said the investigation was in its earliest stages. He said there was no immediate threat to the public. That last statement, offered in good faith, based on what was known at that moment, would become one of the most contested claims of the weeks that followed, repeated back to the department in community meetings and online comment sections with increasing sharpness as days passed without an arrest, because the killer had not been identified. The weapon had not been found. There was no obvious motive, and the person who had done this was, as far as anyone could determine, still somewhere in the world, moving freely through it. The Moscow Police Department had fewer than 40 sworn officers at the time of the murders. They had never worked a case of this scale or complexity. Within 48 hours, they had formally requested assistance from the Idaho State Police and the FBI. Within a week, the investigation had grown to involve hundreds of personnel from multiple agencies. Tip lines were flooded. 9,000 tips would eventually come in, a number that sounds like progress until you understand that each one has to be evaluated, cross-referenced, and either pursued or eliminated, and that the vast majority of them lead nowhere. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the same unit that pioneered criminal profiling in the United States in the 1970s and 1980s, based out of Quantico, Virginia, was brought in to construct a profile of the likely offender. The unit's involvement signals something to anyone paying attention. This was not a case that local resources alone could resolve. What investigators were looking at from the physical evidence at the scene was a crime of unusual deliberateness. The killer had entered through a sliding glass door on the lower level of the house, a door that had been left unlocked, not forced. They had moved upstairs through a house they appeared to navigate with some degree of familiarity, or at minimum with enough composure not to make errors that would wake the surviving roommates below. The 4 victims were killed in 2 separate rooms on the upper floors. Ethan and Xana were in one room. Kaylee and Maddie were in another. The crime scene indicated the killer had moved between those rooms deliberately. There was no sign of sexual assault. There was no sign of robbery. Nothing appeared to have been taken. Nothing was visibly disturbed beyond the rooms where the killings occurred. The dog, a small dog belonging to one of the roommates present in the house that night, was unharmed. This told investigators something important and something deeply unsettling. This was not a crime of opportunity. It was not a home invasion gone wrong. It was not a robbery interrupted or a confrontation that escalated. The person who entered that house on the night of November 12th came to do exactly what they did. They came with a weapon. They came knowing the layout well enough to move through it. And when they were done, they left the same way they came in, through the sliding glass door, into the cold, into the dark, and away. The community's response to that reality was immediate, and in some ways impossible to contain. Within days of the murders, Moscow had transformed into a version of itself that its longtime residents barely recognized. Students who had never locked their doors were buying deadbolts from the hardware store on Main Street, which ran out of stock twice in the first week. Landlords were fielding calls about security cameras. The university held a series of town halls in the largest lecture halls on campus, standing room only, where administrators tried to answer questions they didn't have answers to. Parents drove from across the state, from Boise, from Twin Falls, from Coeur d'Alene, to bring their children home, or at least to see the town with their own eyes. Enrollment inquiries for the spring semester dropped noticeably. The football team played their remaining home games in a stadium that felt different, quieter, more watchful, the usual noise of a Saturday afternoon carrying an undertone of something that wasn't there before. And the rumors began, in the absence of information, because investigators were appropriately tight with operational details to protect the integrity of the case. the internet filled the vacuum with extraordinary speed and volume. True crime forums on Reddit assembled threads running to tens of thousands of comments. TikTok videos offering theories about specific suspects accumulated hundreds of thousands of views within hours of posting. Podcasters, who had never set foot in Idaho and had no sources inside the investigation, produced daily episodes that were consumed by millions of listeners. Names were floated, shared, amplified, and accused. Private individuals who had no connection to the case found their names and home addresses posted online by strangers who had convinced themselves through the logic of forum consensus that they had identified the killer. One man, a former classmate of the victims with no criminal history and no connection to the crime, was so thoroughly harassed that he had to issue a public statement denying involvement, a statement that itself became fodder for further speculation. The Moscow Police Department issued repeated formal warnings about vigilante speculation and the real harm it caused to innocent people. It did not stop. The first weeks of the investigation produced a series of carefully worded public statements that, taken together, painted a portrait of a department working methodically under pressure it had never anticipated. Investigators confirmed the sliding glass door entry point. They confirmed the estimated time of death window. They confirmed the dog's presence and safety. They confirmed that the two surviving roommates had not seen the attacker. They released a map of the neighborhood, showing the area where they were seeking information about vehicles and foot traffic in the hours between midnight and 4 a.m. on November 13th. What they did not confirm, and what the absence of confirmation made louder by the day, was any named suspect, any described suspect, any indication that the investigation had a direction. Then, on November 18th, 5 days after the murders, investigators released a specific piece of information that shifted the shape of the case publicly. They were looking for a white Hyundai Elantra, a common, unremarkable sedan, the kind that fills parking lots on any college campus in America, seen in the area of King Road in the early morning hours of November 13th. The car had been captured on multiple surveillance cameras in the vicinity of the house. Investigators were careful to frame this as an effort to speak with whoever had been driving it, not as the identification of a suspect vehicle. But the release of that detail changed something. There was something specific to look for now: a shape, a color, a make and model. The white Elantra became the axis around which the next phase of the case turned. License plate reader data from traffic cameras across Moscow and the surrounding Ploce region. Surveillance footage pulled from gas stations, parking lots, ATMs, and private businesses across a radius of dozens of miles. The FBI's resources applied to tracking the movement of a specific make and model. There were thousands of white Hyundai Elantras registered in Idaho and Washington alone, across hundreds of miles of highway and back road. It was painstaking work, the kind that doesn't make for dramatic television, but is the actual engine of most solved homicide cases: patient, methodical accumulation of data points, each one narrowing the field until a picture begins to emerge from the noise. By late November, investigators had a direction. They weren't ready to say so publicly, but the white Elantra had led them somewhere specific. Bryan Kohberger was 28 years old, a PhD student in the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. Pullman sits approximately 8 miles west of Moscow, across the state line, connected to it by U.S. Route 8, a drive of about 12 minutes on a clear night. The two towns share a regional identity built around their universities. Students from WSU and students from the University of Idaho regularly appear at each other's parties, bars, and campus events. The border between them is administrative, not social. Kohberger had moved to Pullman in August 2022 to begin his doctoral program, arriving from Pennsylvania with a graduate degree already in hand and a research focus on criminal behavior. He drove a white Hyundai Elantra. He had no prior criminal convictions in Idaho or Washington. His academic background was in criminal justice. He had completed a master's degree at DeSales University in Center Valley, Pennsylvania, where he had also served as a teaching assistant and conducted research specifically on what motivates people to commit crimes and how offenders perceive and rationalize their own actions. He had applied to work as an unpaid intern with the Washington State University Police Department in the fall of 2022, just weeks before the murders on King Road. The application was still pending at the time of his arrest. He had, in other words, been seeking a formal relationship with law enforcement at the same time investigators would come to believe that he was conducting surveillance on a house 8 miles away. None of that was public knowledge in late November 2022. What was public was the tip line, the white Elantra, and the silence from investigators that the community increasingly interpreted, understandably if incorrectly, as either incompetence or the deliberate suppression of information. Neither was accurate. What was actually happening behind the careful public statements and the absence of named suspects was an investigation building toward something. On December 19th, Bryan Kohberger's family drove from Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, a small community in the Pocono Mountains about 90 minutes northwest of Philadelphia, to Pullman, Washington, to pick him up for the holiday break. He traveled back across the country with them by car, a journey of roughly 2,700 miles. The decision to drive rather than fly, and the specific route taken, would later draw scrutiny from investigators tracking his movements. By the time the family reached Pennsylvania, law enforcement in Idaho had made a decision. On December 30th, 2022, 47 days after the murders on King Road, they moved. Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home in Albrightsville by a coordinated team that included Pennsylvania State Police and investigators from Idaho. The operation was executed before dawn in the cold dark of a Pennsylvania winter morning. He was taken into custody without incident. No struggle, no flight attempt, no dramatic confrontation. He was transported to Monroe County Correctional Facility in Pennsylvania and held pending extradition. He arrived in Idaho in the first week of January 2023, transported by plane, and was booked into the Lada County Jail in Moscow, less than 2 miles from the house on King Road. The charging document, the probable cause affidavit, was unsealed when he arrived in Idaho, and what it contained was a detailed reconstruction of the 47 days of investigation that had brought law enforcement to his door. The affidavit describes cell phone data placing Kohberger's device in the vicinity of 1122 King Road on at least 12 separate occasions in the months before the murders, including multiple visits in the late night and early morning hours when the neighborhood was quiet and the presence of a car moving slowly past a student rental house had no obvious innocent explanation. 12 visits, not one, not 2. 12 documented instances of a phone pinging towers in the immediate area of that specific address, spread across the weeks and months leading up to November 13th. It described DNA recovered from a tan leather knife sheath found at the crime scene, left on one of the victim's beds, a detail that had been withheld from public disclosure until the affidavit's release. The DNA profile developed from material on that sheath matched a male profile. When investigators obtained a DNA sample from trash discarded outside the Kohberger family home in Pennsylvania, a method that does not require a warrant under established Fourth Amendment precedent, the DNA from the sheath matched the Kohberger family's genetic profile with a statistical probability that the affidavit described as effectively certain. The sheath belonged to someone in that family. Given everything else, investigators knew which family member. It described the white Hyundai Elantra, captured on surveillance footage in the neighborhood of King Road at 4:04 a.m. on November 13th, 7 minutes before Dylan Mortensen made her 911 call. The car was moving slowly through the residential streets near the house, its headlights off, in the direction of 1122 King Road. It was captured again on a highway camera, heading away from Moscow approximately 20 minutes later, moving at normal speed, lights now on, heading west toward Pullman. It described a witness, a fellow student who had encountered Kohberger at a social gathering in the fall of 2022, who described him as socially awkward and intense in a way that had made her uncomfortable, someone whose attention felt different from ordinary social interest. It described Kaylee Goncalves' phone records, showing that an unknown number had contacted her multiple times in the weeks before her death, including late-night messages that she did not respond to. Whether that number was connected to Kohberger was not definitively established in the affidavit, but its presence in the document was not incidental. The picture the affidavit assembled was not of a random attacker who had chosen a house at chance. It was of someone who had been watching, someone who had been circling, returning, mapping, who had, over the course of months, developed a fixation on a specific address and possibly on specific people within it, and who had, on the night of November 12th into the 13th, acted on whatever that fixation had become. Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of felony burglary. He pleaded not guilty at his arraignment in May 2023, entering the plea in a courtroom in Moscow that had been expanded with overflow seating to accommodate the press and public. His defense team, led by public defender Ann Taylor, an experienced attorney who had handled capital cases in Idaho before, immediately began the work of challenging the state's case on multiple fronts. They filed motions to suppress the DNA evidence, arguing that the use of investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that cross-references consumer DNA databases like GED Match to identify relatives of an unknown DNA contributor, raised serious Fourth Amendment concerns about warrantless searches of genetic information. They challenged the cell phone data. They challenged the process by which the surviving roommates had given their accounts in the immediate aftermath of the discovery. They challenged the composition of the grand jury that had returned the indictment. The legal maneuvering that followed was dense and procedurally complex, as it invariably is in any capital case where the state is seeking the death penalty and the defense has both the obligation and the resources to challenge every element of the prosecution's foundation. Idaho prosecutors had indicated early in the proceedings that they intended to seek death. The case was assigned to Judge John Judge, a name that would become quietly familiar to anyone following the proceedings closely, in Lada County District Court in Moscow. One of the most significant legal battles of the pretrial period concerned a sweeping gag order that Judge John Judge imposed in June 2023, prohibiting all parties, prosecutors, defense attorneys, law enforcement officers, and witnesses from making public statements about the case outside of formal court filings. The order was challenged by a coalition of media organizations, including several major national outlets, who argued it was overbroad and violated the First Amendment. Parts of it were modified on appeal, but its existence and the ferocity with which it was contested reflected the degree to which this case had saturated public discourse in ways that genuinely threatened the possibility of a fair trial. Finding 12 impartial jurors in Idaho, or anywhere in the United States, given the volume of national coverage, was going to be a challenge that no amount of voir dire could entirely solve. The families of the 4 victims navigated all of this, while also navigating grief that had no clean edges and no clear endpoint. Kaylee Goncalves' parents, Steve and Christy, became public voices, not because they sought media attention, but because the attention came regardless, and they chose to direct it toward keeping their daughter's name attached to a real person rather than a true crime abstraction. They gave interviews. They attended hearings. They pushed back, publicly and specifically, against the way the case was being consumed online, against the podcasters and the forum theorists who discussed their daughter as a narrative element. Madison Mogen's family made similar appeals, asking repeatedly that people remember who these 4 people actually were, not characters in a story, but specific human beings with specific histories and specific futures that had been taken from them. Ethan Chapin's family and Xana Kernodle's family were quieter publicly but present throughout the legal proceedings, sitting in the courtroom gallery through hearings that lasted hours and produced, from their perspective, incremental procedural motion rather than anything resembling resolution. What all 4 families shared was a particular kind of waiting, the slow procedural machinery of a capital case grinding forward in months-long increments, each hearing producing new filings, new motions, new delays, while the person charged with killing their children sat in a jail cell in Moscow, Idaho, reading case documents and conferring with his attorneys, exercising his constitutional rights in a system that had been built, in part, to ensure that even the worst things people do to each other are adjudicated carefully. The trial was originally scheduled for October 2023. It was postponed, then rescheduled for June 2024, then postponed again for reasons that were procedural, the volume of evidence, the complexity of the motions, the logistics of a case that had generated hundreds of thousands of pages of discovery material. By the time the case moved toward its next significant threshold, more than a year and a half had passed since the night on King Road. Then something shifted. In July 2024, Bryan Kohberger's defense team filed a notice that they intended to pursue an alibi defense, claiming that Kohberger had been driving alone in the early morning hours of November 13th, and that cell tower data would support his location being somewhere other than King Road at the relevant time. It was an unusual move for multiple reasons. Alibi defenses are typically established and developed early in the pretrial process, not introduced 18 months after arrest. Filing it at this stage raised immediate questions among legal observers about the strength of the alibi, the evidence that would be used to support it, and the strategic calculation behind introducing it so late in the proceedings. The prosecution responded with additional evidence disclosures. The back and forth between the two sides accelerated through the summer of 2024. And then, on August 26, 2024, Bryan Kohberger appeared in a Latah County courtroom and entered an Alford plea to all 5 charges. An Alford plea is a specific legal mechanism established by a 1970 U.S. Supreme Court decision that allows a defendant to accept a guilty verdict and the associated sentence without formally admitting guilt. The defendant is, in effect, acknowledging that the prosecution's evidence is sufficient to likely result in conviction at trial, while maintaining a personal claim of innocence. It is used in cases where the evidence against a defendant is overwhelming and where defense attorneys have calculated that proceeding to trial carries a higher risk than a negotiated resolution. It is not a common outcome in high-profile capital cases, and its use here was immediately and extensively analyzed by legal commentators. In exchange for the Alford plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Kohberger was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole on each of the 4 murder counts, with sentences to be served consecutively. He will not be eligible for release under any circumstances. He will spend the remainder of his life in the custody of the Idaho Department of Correction. The sentencing hearing on August 26th lasted several hours. The families of the victims were given the opportunity to address the court directly, and each of them took it. Steve Goncalves, Kaylee's father, spoke at length about his daughter's laugh, about the particular way she had of making everyone in a room feel seen, about the Sandpoint childhood she and Maddie had shared, about the marketing career she had been building toward, about the grandchildren he would not have. He was direct and measured and unflinching about his feelings regarding the plea agreement, which he did not fully support. He had hoped for a trial, not out of a desire for spectacle, but out of a need for a complete public accounting of what had happened inside that house, a record that a plea agreement does not create. Kaylee Goncalves spoke. Madison Mogen's mother spoke, her voice steady in a way that seemed to cost her something. Ethan Chapin's parents spoke. Xana Kernodle's family spoke. Each statement was different in tone and in the specific texture of the grief it carried. All of them were asking some version of the same question. How do you stand in a courtroom, in a town where your child used to walk to class, and find language adequate to this? Kohberger made a brief statement expressing condolences to the families. It was received in silence. The case officially closed on that day in August 2024. But the questions it raised about how an academically credentialed young man pursuing a PhD in the study of criminal behavior arrived at a house on King Road with a fixed-blade knife, about what the 12 documented visits to that address in the months prior meant in terms of planning and intent, about whether there were moments in classrooms or hallways or online spaces where something visible had been present and gone unrecognized. Those questions do not have a courtroom answer. They were not resolved by the plea. They remain open in the way that the most disturbing questions tend to remain open, not because the facts are unknown, but because the facts, fully assembled, still do not explain the thing at their center. Moscow, Idaho, has tried to return to something like itself. The house at 1122 King Road was demolished in December 2023, following the acquisition of the property by the university and the city. The demolition took less than a day. The lot is empty now, a rectangle of flattened ground on a residential street, unremarkable except for what it is. Students still walk past it on their way to class. The university installed a memorial in a campus garden, a quiet space with plantings and a bench, and the 4 names in stone. The football team still plays on fall Saturdays. The coffee shops on Main Street still know your order. But the town that existed before 4:11 a.m. on November 13th, 2022 is not entirely recoverable. Not because Moscow is defined by what happened there. It isn't, and the people who live and work and study there would resist that definition with justification. But because the particular ease of a place that has never had to think about something like this cannot be fully reinstalled once it has been removed. It lives now alongside the knowledge. The two things coexist. Ethan Chapin was 20 years old. Xana Kernodle was 20 years old. Madison Mogen was 21. Kaylee Goncalves was 21. They were in the part of their lives where the future is not yet a fixed thing, where the person they were going to become was still being assembled, still being discovered, still open to revision. That is the part that was taken. Not just the years that followed, but the possibility that those years represented. The investigation that identified Bryan Kohberger was by any objective measure a significant piece of police and forensic work. The application of investigative genetic genealogy to narrow a DNA match from an unknown contributor to a specific family. The patient cross-referencing of cell phone tower data, license plate reader records, and surveillance footage across 2 states. The coordination between a small-town police department that had never worked a case of this scale and the full resources of the FBI and Idaho State Police. All of it represents what a serious, methodical homicide investigation looks like when it functions the way it is supposed to. The 47 days between the murders and the arrest, which felt agonizing to the community living through them, and understandably so, were, by the standards of complex homicide investigations, a relatively short interval. That does not make the outcome feel like justice to the people who needed it most. It makes it feel like the best available version of an inadequate substitute, which is, more often than people want to acknowledge, what the criminal justice system actually delivers. Bryan Kohberger is 30 years old as of 2024. He will grow old in a cell. He has offered no public explanation, no account of motive, no statement that addresses the fundamental question of what drove him to that house on that night, no acknowledgement that gives the families anything to work with. His offered plea preserves his legal right to maintain innocence while accepting the consequences of guilt. Whatever he knows about his own intentions, he has chosen to keep. That silence is, in its own way, a final act of control. The knife sheath, tan leather consistent with a Ka-Bar brand design, commonly sold through outdoor and military surplus retailers, was the piece of physical evidence that most directly connected Kohberger to the crime scene. The knife itself was never recovered. It is presumably somewhere along the route he drove in the days after November 13th, at the bottom of a river, buried in a landfill, discarded along a highway shoulder in the dark. It may never be found. The sheath, sitting on a victim's bed in a house on King Road, waiting to be discovered by the first officers through the door, was enough. The 2 surviving roommates, Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen, have not spoken publicly at length about what they experienced that night. That is their right, entirely and without qualification. What they carry from having been inside that house is not something that belongs to anyone else's story. They are living their lives. They deserve to do so without being asked again and again to return to a morning they did not choose and cannot undo. If this case stayed with you, the forensic patience it took to build, the way a community fractures and slowly reassembles, the questions that a courtroom can close without ever fully answering, there is another case on this channel that follows a similar arc, a disappearance that sent investigators in circles for over a decade before a single piece of overlooked evidence changed everything. It is waiting for you next.